Hey everybody, Rob here. It's time for a couple of new ProRevenge stories. First one, my parents are a level of petty I aspire to after opening a business solely to shut down their former employer. Let's jump right in. Hey, thank you for subscribing, and if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories. A little background. My parents grew up very poor, dropped out of school, and while they worked steady jobs, we were very poor when I was growing up. My dad worked in a factory under terrible conditions, and my mom stayed home with my brother and I until we were both old enough to be in school full time. We've always had lots of animals for food as well as lots of pets. Consequently, they learned how to groom dogs and became very good at it. Cue my mom getting a job at a local pet store as a dog groomer. She was hired by the owner, who was also a pastor at a church near our home and an assistant principal at a local high school. My dad also quit his job at the factory to work with her very soon after. I was maybe 8 at the time, so after school, I would hang out at the store and help clean, do homework, etc. This is relevant only because their boss was also a pedo. He was constantly trying to get me to run errands with him, go for rides across town, etc. My parents knew what was up and always said no. Not that I wanted to go anywhere with this creepy butthole, but I was shy and didn't yet know how to say no to a grown-up. After working for him for a couple years and amassing quite a large clientele, all the while working for pennies, I think I recall them saying he paid them maybe $150 a week, both of them, not each. He decided he was going to fire my dad and keep my mom on so he could pay her less. They heard about this though and formed a plan. They would open their own pet store, offering grooming services and sell their products barely above cost so he couldn't compete with their prices. They left, taking all of their customers with them, and he was left scrambling to find a replacement groomer. Our store eventually became so popular that we moved to a larger location after only a couple of years. By now, I was about 12 and managing the pet store by myself after school, on weekends, and over summer break. I loved it. By the time I was 14, Pet Store Pedo, who'd owned his business for at least 15 years, had to shut down. My parents closed their store very shortly after and just continued their grooming business. I'd like to say the butthole got what he deserved, but I don't know what happened to him after that. I think he was, and maybe still is a pastor if he's still alive, and anything short of prison or a beatdown by an angry parent isn't enough. The dedication those parents had was pretty crazy. They shut down their store right after the butthole shut down his store. That's a level of dedication that I aspire to as well. On to our next story. Mess with my kids? That's gonna cost you a pretty penny and get you in trouble with the law. So I've got an acquaintance, Richard, who has always been of the I know better than you school of thought. What makes it worse is that he literally received his PhD in physics from one of my country's top universities about 6 months ago. So he's not a dummy. The problem is that he thinks that because he's a physics genius, that means he knows better than everyone about everything. Just an example, my kids are in Montessori schools. This is a decision my wife and I reached together, and we're very happy with it. When he heard, he went on a 30-minute rant and lecture about how we're throwing our money away and Montessori is nonsense. When I told him that I had read and even professionally translated studies proving the opposite and gave him some real-world examples, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, etc., he still would not admit he might not be 100% correct. Not the subject of this revenge, but so you understand the person we're dealing with. Another thing that's important to note is that Richard does not have Asperger's or anything similar. We joke about this all the time, and he's been tested from here until next week. He's just a really smart, socially oblivious pain in the ass. Given all of the above, I try to limit my time with him, but unfortunately, that isn't always possible. And last week, we were both at the same group braai for a friend, Jack, who was visiting back home from overseas. I've known Jack since grade school, so we brought our families and made it more than just a long time no see type of thing. At some point later on in the afternoon, my eldest, awesome, 10 years old, came to me really sad and said she wanted to go home. When I asked her why, she said that Richard had just spent 15 minutes telling her that she shouldn't eat hot dogs because they're unhealthy, and he explained what went into hot dogs and what they're made out of. Awesome is not a vegetarian, knows that the beef and chicken she eats used to be live animals, and has never professed interest in vegetarianism. At the same time, when a kid is eating a hot dog, they don't care or want to know what's inside. We spoke a bit, I calmed her down, and I told her to ignore Richard and go play with her siblings and her friends. Being a kid, she was thankfully easily distracted by something else and moved on. I didn't want to make a fuss with Jack or with Richard, so I just let it be. This turned out to be a mistake. About 30 minutes later, I heard Awesome scream and begin crying. I ran over to her. Richard had come up to her and knocked her hot dog out of her hand, saying she shouldn't eat that garbage. I handed Awesome over to my wife for damage control, and I took Richard aside and told him that A, you don't ever talk to a man's kids without permission, B, you don't ever teach a man's kids without permission, and C, you sure as shit don't ever touch a man's kids without permission. He doesn't have kids, so I still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. This turned out to be a mistake. Instead of doing the mature thing and moving on, he decided to double down on the hot dog issue. This was the hill he was going to die on. My kids shouldn't be eating hot dogs. Keeping Jack in mind, I disengaged and told him to stay the F away from my family. For the rest of the RV, I kept my eye on him, and he didn't come near them. Jack enjoyed. We all ate some good meat. End of the story as far as I'm concerned. This turned out to be a mistake. A few days later, we received a visit from a child protection officer who claimed that we were neglecting our kids, specifically Awesome. She came in and saw that while the house could have been cleaner, what house with kids is spotless, everything was fine. She sat with Awesome for a few minutes and asked her some questions, said everything was fine, and left. First thing I did was call a friend of mine who was a lawyer, just to be on the safe side. He said it looked to him like we were in the clear, but we should keep in touch with him just in case. Next, I began working the grapevine. It turned out that Richard had been offended by how I treated him after the hot dog incident, so he had filed a false anonymous report. Being Richard and never thinking he could ever be wrong, he was even talking about it as if people should be proud of him for what he did. I had to make sure though, so the last thing I did before dropping the hammer on him was confronting him personally. I set my phone to record and went to his house. He doubled down yet again, saying we were torturing Awesome. He's the one who called protective services on us, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat. This turned out to be a mistake. I'm not the violent type, but I swear I wanted to break the son of a bitch in half. I told him that if he came near myself or anyone in my family again, I'd have a restraining order put on him, and I'd make sure every single one of our shared acquaintances knew why. I listened to the recording in my car, and his admission that he filed a false report came out clear as day. I immediately forwarded it to my lawyer, who said he'll get the ball rolling with some friends of his with the public prosecutor to see if we could get Richard in trouble using his admission. Still waiting on that, the wheels of justice turn slowly sometimes. Then I enacted my actual revenge. See, after he got his PhD, Richard bragged about the new flat he'd be moving into as soon as he sold his current flat. To that end, he renovated most of his current flat, including putting in lots of new and expensive features that required lots of electrical work. He did the same on his new flat. He did most of the electrical work himself, which is a big no-no unless you're licensed. I called in an inspector on both of his flats who asked to see certification on who did the electrical work. Obviously, there was no certification. It wouldn't surprise me if, Richard being Richard, he began arguing with the inspector that his work was good enough and he didn't need to pay someone else to do it for him. I haven't seen or spoken to Richard since, but I've heard that he had to bring in a certified electrician to examine every single change he made in both flats. This meant dismantling everything and having it inspected. Turns out, the buyers of his old flat weren't happy with the delay in receiving the keys, and were even unhappier when they learned why there was a delay. They walked away from the deal and are taking him to court. Because his sale fell through, he's now in the hole paying mortgages on 2 flats. I don't know if there was a fine levied against him, but I sure as hell hope so. Lesson of the story: you don't ever F with a man's kids. The one thing that's eating at me here is that OP says he was going to give him the benefit of the doubt because he didn't have kids. Wait a second, isn't it just common knowledge that you don't mess with somebody else's kids? Especially, you don't hit something out of their hands or even touch them. I mean, come on. I want to thank both OPs for posting their stories to the ProRevenge subreddit. You can visit them at the links in the description below. Please go there and give them an upvote. Once again, this is Rob from Karma Comment Chameleon saying thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with your friends. And we'll see you in the next one.